So the next question is, what is the role of sex in our spiritual practice? It's strange that it's even a question, because actually in ancient times it would never have to be a question at all. In those days, and I'm talking about several thousand years ago, all the great sages and all the great yogis and masters, they were family people. They were householders with large families. Okay? They did not seem to have any conflict about sex or spiritual practice, which is the case these days. That's why there is such a question at all. Okay? Otherwise, let's look at what sex is all about. I mean, it's an instinct. Okay? Nature has given it to us because we have to reproduce. Okay? Sexual energy is necessary for the survival of the human species. Okay? That's why we have sex in the first place, from the animal consciousness point of view. Okay? As we evolved more, we formed relationships. Okay? And the sexual act became part of these relationships. So, from an animal point of view, the sex act was associated with the pleasure principle. While on a higher level, it became part of the emotional and mental satisfaction, part of the relationship. So, how does it become associated with spiritual practice? It so happens that sexual energy is the largest energy source available to human beings, freely available. Okay, later we're going to talk about a potential energy that is even greater, called Kundalini, but that is not normally available to us for use. So sexual energy is readily available. Nature has given this energy to us. Okay, it's part of our makeup. Okay. In the past, it was not a question, because people would pursue their spiritual practice and they would have families and they would become enlightened and spiritually evolved while doing their duty to their society, having kids, propagating society, at the same time having meaningful relationship with their significant others. And both can become enlightened. And there were many cases where husband and wives were both advanced yogis, right? Without even considering what sex was all about. Okay? So they had sex in the bed and they meditated on their meditation mat. Right? So these were two different activities, just as we eat food during our meals and we don't eat the food while we're meditating. Although advanced yogis being always in meditation, of course, no matter what activity they're doing, they are in a high meditative state. But I'm talking about practitioners. They don't mix food and practice, and in the old days they didn't particularly mix sex and the spiritual practice either, and both made progress. Now what happened was that around 600 BC onwards, okay, there was a dip in our human consciousness. Okay, people called this a minor Kali Yuga. Okay, so in recognition of this dip in human consciousness, the Lord Buddha, very advanced and great enlightened master and yogi, he actually left his family to pursue his enlightenment. Okay? That was a big break from tradition. Normally, you could have your family and your spiritual advancement. But at that time, he wanted to show by example that our consciousness had been lowered. So he had to leave his family, go into the wilderness, okay, and become enlightened. And then he formed a monastic order. It's the first in history, probably, that I know of an order of renunciates, okay, that did not have family, lived on their own, and ostensibly renounced sex, okay, so that they could pursue the spiritual path. Now, this is a break from tradition. Okay? It seems like it's quite understandable now because we've had over 2,500 years of it, but at that time it was a big break from tradition. So keep that in mind. It's not the way it always had been. Now, because of all this, there seems to have been an association that if you're really serious, you would drop sex and take up the spiritual path. And if you had sex, you couldn't be, really serious about the spiritual path. Okay? This is history. This is what happened at that time. Now, also at the same time, you know how there's an action, there's reaction. At the same time, other advanced yogis, they had a reaction to this, and they said, well, I think we can utilize the energy of sex, okay? And so there arose tantric systems where they try to harness the sexual energy as part of their spiritual practice. Okay, this is really very difficult and very advanced stuff. All right, okay, really walking on the fine edge of the sword here, and you can get cut very easily. It's not normally recommended, and over the several thousands of years since the tantric systems have been around, okay, it's been a mixed bag of masters and charlatans, mostly charlatans. It's very difficult right now to find a true tantric master, okay, that can harness the sexual energy for spiritual growth. In the Kundalini Kriya Yoga and in most spiritual systems, we are working to transform the available and free spirit, the sexual energy, into spiritual energy. And it is the spiritual energy that propels us into higher consciousness. All right? We don't worry too much about the sexual energy. It's already being taken care of. Any excess sexual energy is going to be transformed by a true spiritual practice. And we don't have to try to harness that sexual energy separately. We can live our normal life, especially in Kriya Yoga. Okay, it's meant for householders. Okay, the great Mahavtar Babaji has given this Kriya Yoga to us, to householders. Okay, so you can have your normal sex and practice your spiritual path and achieve your self-realization at the same time. This is particularly difficult to understand in the West because of another piece of little history is the rise of certain religions in the West that treat sex as something negative. All right. This has occurred in part because of certain great saints in these religions who had problems with sex, and one of them especially I want to point out is St. Augustine, who really associated the sex act with something he called the original sin. Right? And that has really messed up a lot of Western people, and there's a lot of guilt and problems associated with the sex act. Okay, let's throw that all away. Okay, forget that. All right. Also, let's forget about Tantra at this time. Okay, we can talk about it a little more later. Okay, of course, if you overdo things, anything, if you overeat, if you have too much indulgence in sex, that could harm your energy systems. And we're not wanting to justify that kind of thing. I'm just talking about normal, common sense type activities. Okay, so, no problem. Okay, the spiritual practice has techniques which transform your excess sexual energy into spiritual energy.